You know, as strong as the Gaang was, from a character writing standpoint I mean, they would never have been able to hold up the entirety of the show by themselves. Well, no, they probably could, they were all phenomenal characters. But the show wasn't just about them, it was also about the world they lived in. One of the reasons Avatar was so interesting was because one of the messages of the show was that the world is beautiful and full of amazing people. The reason Sozin thought the world needed to be put under Fire Nation rule was because he never left the Fire Nation. He only saw what they had and decided that the rest of the world needed it too. But Roku, who did travel the world, who interacted with its people and experienced what it had to offer, knew that the world was already fine the way it was. Sozin was ultimately blinded by an overwhelming and malignant sense of nationalism. And nationalism is a festering rot that can only flourish in a people made separate from the rest of the world. If you never leave your walled garden, you'll never know just how beautiful everything else is, and the garden becomes your only world. This is why the Avatar journey is so important, because it's all about leaving what you know and experiencing the cultures of the world, in meeting their people and learning and growing from the journey. And this is what we watch Aang do over the course of the show. From the Arctic civilizations of the Water Tribe, to the massive cities of the Earth Kingdom, to the stark contrasts of the Fire Nation, Aang didn't just learn about the elements, he learned about people, about cultures and families and conflict and joy and sorrow, and everything that makes up life. Writing, I thought this was about Korra's supporting cast. Why are you waxing political about Avatar? Well, I'm adding context, just give me a minute. Now where was I? Alright. Hell, this extended to the other members of the Gaang as well. You'll never grow as a person if you don't experience people. And the thing is, if the show hadn't had so many interesting characters, that message would have fallen flat. If the world wasn't filled with so many flawed but ultimately good people, the journey wouldn't have changed the party in as positive a way as it did. More importantly though, it wouldn't have been as fun. Avatar had a phenomenal supporting cast. And if you ask fans of the show, they won't just tell you their favourite member of the supporting cast, it's highly likely they'll be able to ramble off a long list of characters they absolutely loved. And a lot of them are probably bit characters that had no real importance to the narrative, but left such a good impression that you just never forget them. But the thing about the supporting cast is that they didn't tend to stick around. A lot of them were one-off episodic characters, and of the characters that did return, most of them only really showed up in climax episodes. It was largely only in The Day of Black Sun and Sozin's Comet that you'd get large reunions. And with the exception of Jet and his gang, repeats were relatively rare. And this honestly worked just fine. The gang was always on the move and almost never revisited places, so there was no real need for characters from said places to return. Korra doesn't do this. This is partially due to the fact that while Avatar was largely episodic, with an overarching narrative, Korra is serialized, and so one-off characters just don't happen very often, because the narrative doesn't really allow for it all that much. But it's also because Korra doesn't go on an Avatar journey. In general, the crew remains largely locked into one area per season, sometimes two if they're feeling fancy. So characters tend to stick around more, and this demands a different type of supporting cast than The Last Airbender had, as well as a largely smaller one, since most of them aren't just supporting, they're reoccurring, and they require more time and attention. And don't get me wrong, Korra has a good supporting cast with a lot of strong and memorable characters, but some of them might be a little too strong. So in my last video in the series, I talked about the crew, where they succeeded, where they need more work, all that good stuff. And a reoccurring problem with them was that they really weren't given the development they needed to carry the show like the Gang was. And that's because most of the work went into the supporting cast, into Tenzin and Lin and all the other characters with actual, well, character. And that's who I'd like to talk about today, because while I do really like the show, the supporting cast is a bit of a mixed bag to say the least. Before I continue though, I do want to clarify that while I will be talking about basically the entire supporting cast, I won't be offering improvements or expansions for all of them, as there isn't enough time in the day, and also because a lot of them just don't need it. Members of the supporting cast don't necessarily need to be expanded upon, despite what some members of the fandom will tell you. Also, the villains will be getting their own video. So yeah, with that out of the way, let's get started, shall we? Let's talk about Korra's supporting cast, starting with...
We ended up a tiny piece of every heart of every part of every story of every grave. It falls apart, it's not hard to beat there.
I think this is as good a place to start as any, considering how much the story is centered on Republic City, and Tenzin's family are the first real characters we're introduced to after Korra and her parents. Well, I mean, there's Katara, but I'll get to her later. Heads up, I'm going to be gushing about Tenzin for a while, you've been warned. So a lot of time and focus is dedicated to Tenzin and his family, which makes sense because Tenzin is Korra's first real teacher. He's also kind of the best character in the entire show. He's certainly one of the most likable, just by virtue of how much effort was put into him. He's extremely charming, interesting, and often quite funny.
Don't bring my mother into this.
But Tenzin gets by on more than simple charm. He's also one of the more complicated characters, having a great sense of duty and pride, both of which are sources of strength and weakness, particularly the pride. He also genuinely cares for Korra, seemingly more than anyone else at times, and I honestly really like how their relationship grows over time, starting off good, if a bit distant, before getting rocky as their frustration with each other gets in the way, and eventually growing into a great deal of mutual respect. Korra can rely on Tenzin for guidance and advice, and, at least in the first season, he kind of acts as a surrogate father figure to her, and I really adore their student-teacher dynamic, because Tenzin starts off as a fucking terrible teacher. See, the thing about Tenzin is that, due to growing up as the only heir to the entirety of air nomad culture, he ended up developing quite a complex about it. Ironically, for an airbender, he has these very rigid ideas of how things have to be, of how he has to be. He has to be the perfect mentor, spiritual leader, politician. He has to be everything because how can he be anything else? He's the hope for the future of an entire nation. He can't let us fall down. And it's because of all this that he starts out as a shit teacher who has to learn to be more flexible. Flexibility is actually his greatest weakness, and it's a lesson he has to learn 3 times over. See, while it's very easy to teach his kids, since they're all natural born airbenders and were raised within air nomad culture, it's a very different story with Korra, whose entire bending mentality is fundamentally different. So when she struggles with his teachings, he assumes it must be her fault, but it really isn't, because she's not the teacher, he is. Something I think people are quick to forget is that if a student is trying to learn but can't, the failure isn't on their part, it's on their teacher, or the school system in our world. People learn in different ways, and to insist that everyone must learn the exact same way is to fail your students. Side note, this is, incidentally, why you should never take a class with a professor who brags about how hard it is to pass, because their priority will not be in helping you. To his credit, Tenzin actually learns his lesson fairly quickly when he sees how Korra successfully implements his lectures on spiral movement in her pro bending match, and this is why he doesn't fight her on it after that point, because he realizes she needs a different teaching method than his kids did, and so he integrates pro bending into his curriculum because it's what she needs. Also, I fucking love how supportive he gets of her matches later on. Sports Dad Tenzin is the fucking best, and I really wish we got more of it.
Oh, come on, refs! There was some funny business in that last play.
Wouldn't have guessed you knew the rules of pro bending.
I've been brushing up. That Wolfbat blatantly bent a disc outside of his zone.
He learned the rules of a game he fucking despised because she was passionate about it. That's so sweet. But like I said, this is still a lesson he needs to learn multiple times, and the second time comes in when Korra needs help meditating into the spirit world. See, the air nomads were an exceptionally spiritual people, so much so that they didn't actually have any non-benders. And because he was the only airbending child of Aang, he believes he needs to be a spiritual leader too. But the problem is that he just isn't spiritually adept. He understands the methodology and the theory, but he just can't really do it himself. And this clearly bothers him, considering how upset he gets as he fails again and again. It's actually a really lovely display of vulnerability when he admits his failings.
You've never been into the spirit world?
But you used to spend days in the temple meditating.
Trying to get in. It never happened. It's my greatest shortcoming as an airbender, spiritual leader, and son of Aang.
But ultimately, he accepts that he's not meant to be Korra's spiritual guide. Jinora is, and he has to allow her to help Korra. Later in the exact same season, Tenzin finally achieves his epiphany. He doesn't need to be his father, and he should never have tried to be. Who he is, Tenzin, is enough.
Dad, I failed you. I am no spiritual leader, and I've let the world down. I'll never be the man you were.
You are right. You are trying to hold on to a false perception of yourself. You are not me, and you should not be me. You are Tenzin.
I am not a reflection of my father. I am Tenzin,
I am Tenzin.
Despite his lack of spiritual proficiency, however, he still manages to not only save Jinora and his siblings from the fog of lost souls, but to give Korra the wisdom she needs to fight Unavatu. And fuck, I still hate that name. He's still supporting her, still helping her grow. He believes in and never gives up on her, even when she's given up on herself. It's a really touching scene and honestly one of the bigger reasons I love him so much, because he really does care about her. Despite all this, Tenzin's character arc doesn't actually complete until Season 3, with the rebirth of the Air Nation and his struggle not just to gather the new airbenders, but to connect with them as well.
You'll never have to worry about your worldly possessions again, because you won't have any. You'll get to shave your head. Your best friend will be a giant bison.
Tenzin kind of backslides into his "this is how things have to be" mindset, but it's actually really understandable here. He's so excited about the prospect of new airbenders, he kind of forgets that they had lives before this, and that they need time to adjust. But it's a lesson he learns much quicker this time, and he ends up sacrificing himself to protect his students from the Red Lotus, going full circle from the boy who was born for the future of the Air Nomads to the man who would die to protect it. And while thankfully he doesn't die, his role in the story is largely over after this point, and he symbolically passes the role of leader to Jinora. He is still around after this, but in a much smaller role. He takes part in political discussions, he helps fight Kuvira's mech, and he's there to talk to Korra at the wedding. Tenzin is the only character I have no complaints about. He had the most care put into his writing and is the most consistent. Ironically, despite being written for the role of supporting cast, he has more claim to main character status than most of the crew does. The only thing I wish he'd done was tell Korra that's fucking stupid when she said she needed to suffer to learn compassion, but I don't blame him for that, I blame Bryke for pushing that message at all. But yeah, he's just good. Conversely, oh boy, his family is a mixed bag. I think Bumi is probably the closest to being as complete as Tenzin, at least in the animated series. Being the only non-bender of the siblings, he adopted a reckless attitude to prove he was just as good as any bender. And while he certainly has plenty of achievements to be proud of, he very clearly felt guilty for not being born an airbender, as he feels like he let his dad down. Ironically, even before gaining airbending, he has more spiritual affinity than Tenzin. I honestly really like Bumi. He's just deep enough to avoid completely being a joke character, and he gets some of the better slapstick moments too. On the other hand, it feels like there is a lot of missed potential with Kaya. I know she gets expanded upon more in the comics, and she's even revealed to be a lesbian, but in the show she doesn't really get to do much. It's implied that she also has more of a spiritual affinity than Tenzin, but it doesn't get explored, and she's largely relegated to healing or getting slapped around by Zahir and Minghua. We know she's travelled the world, but in the show the reason why is never explored, and that feels like a missed opportunity. Was it thanks to her travels that she grew more spiritually attuned? Why did she decide to travel in the first place? She has that line in the Fog of Lost Souls about not wanting to be tied down, which feels like something that should have been explored too, but we just don't get that. Did Kaya feel trapped by her familial obligation to take care of Katara when she was grieving Aang's death since her brothers were too busy? It would have been great if any of these questions were explored in the show, but unless you check the wiki, you just won't get any answers. I will say though, Kaya is probably the only adult female character that Bright doesn't get really weird about at some point, so at least she has that. Well, her and Izumi, but Izumi is just kind of there. There's more to say about their relationship with their father, but we'll get to that later. As far as Tenzin's kids go, okay, so they're not bad, they just really don't do much. Jinora is the only one that gets really explored as a character, but the problem is that she really doesn't have much character to explore. She's kind of bookish and withdrawn in Season 1 and part of Season 2, but that gets dropped after she learns to astral project, and she just turns into a plot device for the rest of the series. I'm not even kidding, Jinora's biggest role is as a Deus Ex Machina to save Korra, and they do it 3 separate times. The first is when Korra's losing her spirit kaiju fight, and Jinora comes down to do something that's never explained, and then she leads the other airbenders in their group tornado to save Korra from being suffocated by Zahir, and then she does the same thing when Korra loses to Kuvira. Jinora spends more time being a convenient get out of jail free card than she does being her own character. About the only thing of note about her after Season 2 is that she develops an immediate crush on Kai for no reason other than he's the first boy her age that she's met. She just kind of stops being a real character after Book 2, which is a shame because I actually liked her before this. The problem with Jinora, honestly stems from the fact that Bright was just obsessed with beating the shit out of Korra and needed a way out of all her worst losses. Fixing Jinora would require fixing the writing of the series as a whole, so that Korra doesn't keep getting put in a position where she needs to be saved, which is always right after she breaks out the world's most useless avatar state. If you want my feelings on that whole situation, watch my video on the crew. Incidentally, Kai's relationship to Jinora is the only interesting thing about him, though I'm using that word pretty loosely. When he's first introduced, he's a troublemaker and meant to be a parallel to Mako and Bulin's past, but that gets dropped almost immediately, and that's all there is to say about that. There's not really much to say about the other members of the Air Nation as individuals either, but that's honestly fine. Their role in the story is just to be new airbenders and to spur on Tenzin's character development, and that's what they do. As far as Ikki and Milo go, well, they're also there. I know Ikki was intended to be the annoying one, but I honestly find myself liking her the most, just due to her having some actual energy and not just being a vessel for the plot or fart jokes. She actually kind of reminds me of how my own sister was at that age, just far less angry. And as for Milo, I'll be honest, I don't like Milo very much. I find him far more annoying than the other two, especially in season 4 when he's going all "a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do" mode and making the search for Korra 10 times harder, though it's hilariously schadenfreudig to see him get sick from all those berries after throwing out their food. Also, and I recognise this might just be a me thing, but he hits on Asami in season 1 and I fucking hate that. I had this problem with Elemental too. Can people just stop having 6-year-olds hit on grown-ass women? It isn't funny or charming, it's just really weird and kinda gross, and I've never met a single woman who's comfortable with it, or seen a single female character be comfortable with it. Finally, there's Pema, who I actually like most of the time. She's actually really wise when she's given the chance to show it off, and at most of the time she's kind of funny really. The only real problem with her is that she gets real fucking catty with Lin for literally no reason, which is something I meant to bring up in the last video, but she kind of got lost in the shuffle. I know Bright just thinks this is what women are like because they write Korra being the exact same way with Asami at first, but Pema is a grown-ass woman in her 30s who isn't in competition for Tenzin's affections. She's pretty handily won that contest, considering they're married and have 4 kids with each other. Again, there's no fucking reason for this. It's only a thing because this is just what Bright thinks women are like. Yes, this is something worth complaining about. Fucking learn to write women.
It falls apart if there's not a heart to have.
Speaking of writing women, let's talk about Lin next. Lin is kind of a massive bitch for most of the series. She's largely defined by being a bitter, angry loner who's cut all ties with her family and is obsessed with her job. I'll talk about Su Yin when I get to the section on the Earth Kingdom and Toph a little bit after that, but the bulk of Lin's problems centre around her relationship to her family. Toph was a very hands-off mother, actually to the point of neglect in some ways, and Lin's only real connection to her mother is through the job, which is kind of all she has, and because of this, she comes off as really very unlikable most of the time. She and Korra absolutely hate each other at first, but then Korra impresses her with her pro-bending skills and Lin decides she likes her now, and there's basically no transition for either one of them. I don't want to give the impression I think Lin is a bad person or character though, she's just fucking difficult and borderline authoritarian. What I do like about her is her loyalty to the people she cares about, casting aside her chance to catch Amon to save Korra and even sacrificing herself to ensure that Tenzin's family get away. The few really good moments she gets in season 1 honestly save her from being one of the worst characters in the series. Come season 2 though, and she's basically just relegated to being a roadblock for Mako. A lot of characters get their development set back in season 2, and Lin was no exception. She basically does nothing but be the grumpy police chief the loose cannon has to contend with. Season 3 is where she gets the most development, but it's unfortunately mostly used to make her look like an absolute tool, revealing that she's physically incapable of both accepting that people change and sharing her feelings, to the point that her character arc has to be forced out of her by acupuncture before she attacks her sister, and you know, I think this scene really says a lot.
You think just because you live in a big fancy house and have a chef who cooks you fancy food that you're a different person? Maybe you can fool everyone else, but you can't fool me. I see right through you.
You know what, Lin? You're the one who hasn't changed. You're still a bitter loner who only cares about herself. No wonder Tenzin ended things with you years ago. Okay, I guess this is how it's going to be.
Lynn's grown so attached to her perception of herself as the only normal and stable member of the family that she literally cannot handle the idea that her sister could change. And yeah, the two eventually work it out and fucking talk to each other, but it's still frustrating. And this continues into season 4 when she reunites with Toph, though honestly I just don't like what they do with Toph in this series at all. I'll get into it more later, but suffice to say Lynn's mommy issues make up the bulk of her problems. Oh yeah, and then there's this.
You got off easy. You should have seen Air Temple Island after Tenzin broke up with me.
Ha ha ha. It's funny because she destroyed his home for breaking up with her. Women, am I right? Bryke, why are you like this? Though I will say, I actually like Tenzin and Lynn's friendship. While she still comes off as angry most of the time, it's clear the two of them care for each other, and even when they talk about how they used to date, it mostly comes off as her teasing him instead of actual bitterness, which is a nice change. Other than Lynn, there really aren't many characters to talk about in Republic City outside of the villains. Of the characters that mean anything, there's only really Tarlok and President Raiko. I'm saving Tarlok for the villains video, so that really only leaves the one, and I honestly wasn't sure if I wanted to save Raiko for the villains video as well, because the dude fucking sucks. He's just a massively unhelpful prick for the whole of the series, who gets in Korra's way in season 2 and fucking banishes her from Republic City because his approval rating is in the toilet and he's lashing out like a toddler. And while those two things wouldn't necessarily make him a villain, the fact that he's trying to turn the Earth Kingdom into a puppet state certainly would. No, I'm not kidding. Remember this.
You sure that's the guy you want running the Earth Kingdom? Trust me, we'll be sending a delegation of experienced advisors to handle day-to-day governing.
That's a pretty nakedly obvious attempt at seizing political power from a foreign nation. This is another thing that I'll expand on in the villains video, but let me just say this. The only reason Raiko is in this video and not in that one is because it very clearly wasn't meant to be seen that way, and it doesn't go anywhere anyway, because Kuvira says fuck that and then does her thing. Oh yeah, there's also Iroh and Izumi, who are also here. No, seriously, the two are basically complete non-characters. Iroh literally only exists to be a shot-down solution, and Izumi might as well not exist at all. In every season he's in, Iroh's ships get fucking obliterated. Between the mines in season 1, getting grounded by Raiko and then hit by tidal wave in season 2, and then spirit beamed in season 4, it's kind of a mystery how he still gets to be in charge of a fleet at all. Other than that, he has less personality than Mako, and I don't think you can really fix this because aside from the reinforcements in season 1, most of the conflicts just wouldn't actually be helped by the inclusion of the Navy. He's mostly just there because they introduced him in season 1 and they still wanted someone voiced by Dante Bosco. Izumi, however, is actually disappointing. See, I think the thought process was that because so much focus was put on the Fire Nation in The Last Airbender, they wanted to avoid feeling like they were repeating themselves, so they just quietly cut the Fire Nation out of the story. But the downside of this is that we don't get to see how the Fire Nation, which was the aggressor in the last show, has changed at all. How have they recovered from the militaristic death grip that Ozai and Sozin had on it? Do people dance more now? How is the nation's role in the 100-Year War taught in schools? Propaganda was a huge part of their culture. How has that changed? Izumi kind of addresses this in this scene.
The only way to protect ourselves is with a preemptive strike.
My airbenders won't be part of an unprovoked attack.
Neither will the Fire Nation.
But Fire Lord Izumi, Kuvira is a threat to the world. She has to be stopped.
The Fire Nation has spent too much of its history fighting nonsense wars, and I refuse to drag my nation into another one unless there's no other choice. If you attack Kuvira, you'll do it without my army.
But that's basically it. She's also just kind of there. Alright, moving on.
It's always a surprise when, oh, it's always a surprise when the tide comes in. When the tide comes in. But it's always a surprise when, oh, it's always a surprise when you call again. When you call again.
Book 2 of Korra largely takes place in the lands of the Southern Water Tribe, and most of the characters introduced are literally related to Korra in some way, with two notable exceptions. And while I'm mostly saving Unalaq for the villains video, I will at least discuss his relationship to Tonraq since it informs quite a bit of his character. Korra's father Tonraq is, he's kind of an asshole. See, he was originally from the Northern Water Tribe, but after destroying their sacred grove, he was banished and moved to the Southern Tribe, where he met Senna and eventually had Korra. And it feels like Tonraq is where Korra got her hot-headed personality from, because the two butt heads almost constantly throughout the first half of the season, and they feel very similar. But when it comes down to it, Korra is actually in the right every time they fight. The truth of the matter is that Tonraq just doesn't show Korra any respect as the Avatar. And while you could argue that he's trying to look out for her as her father, all he actually achieves is pushing her away from him and closer to Unalaq. Remember this scene?
I wouldn't mind learning about fighting spirits. Airbending is getting pretty boring.
Tenzin is Korra's instructor. He can give her all the training she needs.
Tonraq completely ignores his daughter's wishes in regards to her own training. And he does it because he's letting his anger at his brother control him. Tonraq has a long history of being controlled by his emotions and that being how his brother manipulates him. Korra is a grown-ass woman and a fully realized avatar, but he still acts like he can tell her what to do, which is so fucking disrespectful. This is a problem I brought up in Korra's section of the crew video, but she really just doesn't get shown any respect, and her dad just seems physically incapable of treating her like an adult. This does start to change after she opens the spirit portal, but it's almost immediately dropped once the Civil War storyline begins. Though I don't think this is a bad thing, because both Korra and Tonraq begin to show a more mature side to themselves as tensions escalate, and I really like this. Korra's ability to de-escalate conflicts between the tribesmen and convince Unalaq to act more reasonably doesn't just demonstrate that she will be a good avatar, but that she is one. If the season had stayed this course and remained focused on the strained familial relationships between the brothers and the tribes, this would have been the single best story that Avatar as a franchise had ever told. Spoilers for the villains video, but I honestly think that making Unalaq a secret Satanist that orchestrated his brother's downfall was the single worst story decision Broik ever made. Speaking of bad decisions, you probably knew this was coming, let's talk about Eska and Desna. So, in my video on the crew, I went off for a while on just how fucking abusive Eska and Bolin's relationship was, and I stand by everything I said 100%. Treating Bolin's abuse as a funny haha joke was fucking despicable, and Broik should be ashamed. And it's honestly a shame, because if it hadn't been for that fucking travesty, I think Eska and Desna would have been my favourite characters in the season. I've got a soft spot in my heart for characters with a really dry sense of humour and delivery, and the twins are drier than the fucking desert. Their line delivery is solid gold, and the fact that they're just a little creepy only makes me like them more. Also, their laughter is fucking hilarious. Ugh, that's so off-putting, I fucking love it. The thing is, Desna remains largely uncharacterized outside of his few funny lines, and the bulk of the attention is put on Eska because she's the one in the relationship. And this is a shame because it would have been cool to hear Desna's thoughts on anything going on at all. But he has no comment on the end of the world, no thoughts on his sister's relationship, fucking nothing. The most characterization he gets is pointing out that their dad was going to let him die, and that one good line about his tailor.
Why didn't anyone tell us we have a secret prison we could have been throwing people in?
I'd like to put my tailor in here. He never gets my cuffs right. They're so creasy.
Eska though, God, I really wish I could like her more, but everything about her is ruined by how she treats Bolin, and by the fact that she doesn't care that she hurt him. And the thing is, I do have to wonder if this isn't informed by her father. Their mother only gets a brief mention when the twins are pondering how to tell her that their dad died, but they don't make it sound like she'll be upset by it. And it makes me wonder, did she learn about relationships from her father? Is she emulating him in how she handles her relationship with Bolin? Children are influenced by their parents more than either party will ever know, and familial relationships tend to form the bedrock of what people consider to be normal, since it's what they grow up with and they largely don't realise it. If your parents' relationship was healthy and loving, you tend to seek out something similar yourself. But if it isn't, your awareness of that will probably influence how you handle your own intimate relationships. For example, I'm a child of divorce, and I was often the only one awake to witness my parents fighting, and something I unpacked in therapy is how I didn't realise just how much I'd go out of my way to avoid something similar to what my parents have. I was aware from a young age that my parents' relationship wasn't a happy one, and that affected how my views on love developed as I grew. But if you're not aware that your parents' relationship is unhappy or unhealthy, how would that change? because seeing how loyal Asuka and Desna are to their father, even when he shows zero interest or care for them, got me thinking about what he's like to their mother. Did Asuka observe that her parents' relationship has a horrible power imbalance and just concluded that that's normal? In The Last Airbender, we see that the Northern Tribe practices arranged marriages. Is that how her parents got together? Was there ever any real love between them? If Asuka grew up with this as her only example of a romantic relationship, it would go a long way to explaining why she treats Bolin like she does. It wouldn't excuse it, but it would at least be something of a baseline to work with. Because outside of her abusive relationship to Bolin and her loyalty to her father, the only other person who seems remotely important to her is Desna, and it seems like Desna is where her true loyalties lie. As the first time she defies her father is when Desna is hurt and he'd die if left alone, and the second time is when Bolin fake confesses and Desna reminds her that their dad was just going to let him die. Like I said in the last video, I think there was a potential for a really powerful story about someone realizing that they'd become an abuser and what that meant to them. Asuka realizing she'd been emulating the man who would have caused the death of her twin and having to come to terms with what that says about her and how she's been treating Bolin would have been an amazing thing to witness. Because while stories about abuse are relatively common, stories about abusers who realize they need to change and then putting in the effort to not only change but make it up to their victims are almost unheard of. And it would speak to the truth that while your victims may never forgive you, and let me be clear, no abuser is owed forgiveness, you can always choose to be better. You can choose to change, to walk the difficult path to recovery and growth. Being a better person is hard, especially if you've fallen into certain behavioural habits and grew up believing them to be normal, but it's still doable. I recognise that this is complete speculation. The fact of the matter is that Brick didn't think any of these things through because they didn't see Asuka's behaviour as a problem. It's just something they found funny, and I guess it's just what they think goth girls are like, which is why they have her say that being a boss and a girlfriend are the same thing, and why she makes Desna sleep in the tub, because Bryke is just really fucking weird about women. The twins and Tonrock all briefly returned for Season 3 to deal with the Red Lotus, and really briefly for Wu's coronation in Season 4, but Tonrock is really the only one of note, since his supposed death ends up being used against Korra when she's poisoned. Korra's mom is also here, but she does absolutely nothing throughout the series aside from look tired or heartbroken, and is largely relegated to making the judge's decision to banish Tonrock extra poignant. Because look at Korra having to comfort her mom, that's really sad. But yeah, she's basically just another non-character. I don't even remember if she's actually named in the show. I had to look it up on the wiki. And I don't really have a solution for this other than to say, write women better, you hacks. She has a scene where she tells Korra that they really wanted to give her a normal childhood, and her obvious exhaustion is actually used as really effective environmental storytelling for Korra's introduction. But other than that, she is pitifully underdeveloped. Fucking do better. You know, a commenter accused me of having a superiority complex, which is a truly ridiculous notion. We Toxtricity are notorious for our quiet and modest nature. Besides, it's not a superiority complex if I am just better than everyone else. Anyway, for the last characters on this list, we have Varric and Julie, who come as a package deal all throughout the show, so why should I separate them here? And I'm going to be frank, I really don't like Varric very much. Time, I think, hasn't been very kind to him. See, Varric was introduced back when the MCU was starting, so billionaire tech bros were really popular at the time, and that's exactly what Varric is. But the years since have proven that billionaire tech bros don't end up being Tony Stark, they end up being Elon Musk, a man so fucking pathetic that he's essentially a living punchline. And now that he's spent the last few years showing his asshole, he and everyone like him look far worse in comparison. And Varric suffers in this context. He's introduced as sort of just a silly little boy engaging in wacky nonsense, but that doesn't really last as he fucks Asami out of her father's company, instigates false flag terrorist attacks, and ultimately makes the civil war worse by getting in the fucking way. And he never really faces any consequences for this. He gets arrested, but he immediately escapes and finds sanctuary in Zaofu, and just none of the cast calls him out for this, with the exception of Asami threatening him in Season 4. They're just like, you suck, whatever, moving on. And then he's just left to his own devices until Season 4 when he starts making super weapons for Kuvira before suffering a completely out of character attack of conscience.
I'm putting the kibosh on this project.
No, you're not. Do you realize what we can do with this kind of power?
Yes, I do. And that's why we gotta put an end to it. What if it fell into the wrong hands?
Since when does that matter to you?
I know, it's not like me, right? Usually I look at a project like this and all I think is, wow, I can make a ton of money off this. But recently, I've been having these strange feelings. Inside, it's like I'm concerned with others. And there's this nagging voice in my head constantly, telling me what's right from wrong.
I believe that voice is your conscience, sir.
Well, I'm the other voice in your head, and I'm telling you, you will continue this project.
Sorry? No. I just really gotta stand my ground on this one. Whoa!
Now there's a voice in my head telling me to drop you on the tracks. Should I listen?
I know this is supposed to demonstrate how bad Kuvira is, but I saw her threatening him and all I had to say was, fucking do it, Kuvira, it's the only justice he'll ever face. Because after watching him commit crimes and abuse Julie and enrich himself off the characters I actually like and just never show any form of remorse, I'm not sure what the writers actually expected. Granted, he does actually improve after this and proves helpful on multiple occasions, but it's kind of too little too late, and it's baffling that fans of the show seem to just ignore everything he does and decide he's one of the best characters entirely based off the line, do the thing. Credit where it's due though, Varric actually does have engineering skills and a level of knowledge that Musk doesn't, and Varric at least isn't such a fragile, egomaniacal creep that he'd waste billions of dollars on buying the press for the sole purpose of harassing trans women, nor would he send Ginger a message telling her he'd put a baby in her. So you know, he at least clears that bar, though the bar is admittedly so low it's sticking out of the floor of Satan's wine cellar. And as far as Julie goes, she's just Pepper Potts. She's just the billionaire's assistant who falls in love with him. But while Tony Stark was an actual hero with redeeming qualities who treated Pepper like a person, Varric fucking drags Julie by the neck everywhere he goes and makes her do fucking everything. And then she fake betrays him to sabotage Kuvira and they fight and blah blah blah. I literally cannot think of a single reason for her to actually like Varric enough to marry the guy. I can only attribute it to fucking Stockholm Syndrome, because she's certainly not given any reason to want to be around him. Bright were apparently just like, yeah, she's been in love with him the whole time, but like they did with every other relationship, forgot to establish anything to convince the viewer of it. She just spends 2 seasons suffering through Varric's bullshit demands and his weird foot problems, and then they have one fight, and then they're married, and it just does not sell me on their love for each other. Julie deserved better and I will fucking die on this hill, fuck you.
Baby, if you don't stand for something, how can you ever stand it all? And baby, if you're built on sand, you'll be swept back by the fall. Baby, if you don't stand for something, how can you ever hope to hold the weight of everything you want?
So the Earth Kingdom is kind of weird to talk about, because while we spend the most time there out of any nation, and the biggest group of characters was introduced to the show during this period, most of them either aren't worth talking about or need to be saved for another video. This includes the Earth Queen, Kuvira, and the entirety of the Red Lotus, and that kind of only leaves the Bei-Fong family and Prince Wu. I mean, I guess there's Mako and Bolin's family too, but there's really not anything to say about them, outside the fact that it's a shame that Nana is a bootlicker. And of the Bei-Fong family, only Lin, Opal and Batar Jr. are worth talking about, as Batar Sr. is a complete non-character, Huan is a joke about artists, and Wu and Wei are just the mischievous twin archetype. For all the time spent on the Bei-Fong family in Season 3, very little is actually done with half of them, because the main focus is on Sue and Lin's messed up relationship with each other and their mother. And I've already talked at great length about Lin, so let's get started on Sue. Sue Yin is a character I find both very interesting and utterly infuriating, because she starts off very promising before ultimately catching the stupid as a result of bad writing decisions. Sue's entire thing, for lack of a better word, is that because her mother was so hands-off with her parenting, she grew up as a troublemaker who fell in with the wrong crowd, ended up accidentally scarring Lin, and then was shipped off to avoid scandal. And she technically never had to face any consequences for her actions, at least not as far as Lin is concerned. But it's because of her past that she believes in second chances, which led to her founding Zaofu, a place that encourages people to pursue their passions and become their best selves. It's also what inspired her to take in her cook, who used to be a pirate, and even adopt Kuvira. And I'm going to have a lot to say about this when I talk about her in that upcoming video, but I do want to stress that Zaofu, which I think is supposed to be read as like some kind of hippie commune, is actually a really cool concept. The problem with Lin though comes down to politics. See, The Legend of Korra really wants to position itself as a political show, but it doesn't really end up exploring any of the ideas it brings up. This is actually why I brought up the politics of the original show at the start, because Atla had a very simple message of anti-imperialism. Korra, on the other hand, kind of positions itself as pro-democracy, but it doesn't really do anything with that. It positions the United Republic, which is very obviously coded as America, as the natural progression that the world is and should be moving toward, and by the end of the first season it's a democratic state, but it really doesn't explore the strengths or weaknesses of democracy at all, and just sort of positions it as the best possible option because they said so. And this ends up being a problem for Sue, because she's positioned as a political leader in charge of a sort of socialist state, but she also doesn't fucking have anything of substance to say about it at all. The most we get is that she doesn't like the idea of queens because, I don't know, because it's the future?
I mean, the idea of even having a queen is so outdated. Don't you agree, Korra?
I haven't really thought about it too much.
Well, you should start. The world is evolving and the Earth Queen can evolve with it. Step aside.
Which I think is supposed to be used as a parallel to Zahir saying he doesn't believe in queens, but again they don't do anything with it. And while this in itself wouldn't be all that much worse than how the rest of the show handles its politics, the big problem rears its ugly head in season 4 because the only reason Kuvira is doing the uniting thing at all is because when they asked Sue to help unite the Earth Kingdom, she fucking said no because apparently she doesn't want to impose her ideals on people. But nobody's fucking asking her to become a dictator. They just want her to help bring people together so that they're safe from bandits, marauders, and every jackass with a sharp object and angry eyes. And literally the only reason they do this is so they can excuse making Kuvira the antagonist. Su Yin was characterized as being a natural, wise, and forward-thinking leader who built a city that became a beacon of progress in the Earth Kingdom. And yet she can't think of a single way to bring people together that doesn't involve a conquering army. No fucking wonder Kuvira and the Zaufu guardsmen left. I'd have lost all respect for Su Yin too if I saw her refuse to help a broken nation for literally no reason. Su is so fucking infuriating because she just suffers a stupid attack out of nowhere to act as Kuvira's villainous motivation, and that's bad writing. It should never feel like someone is acting wildly out of character for the sake of moving the story along. That's an idiot plot. She just spends the entirety of season 4 acting the fool and it's fucking annoying. I do have a fix to propose for her, but it's tied into the Kuvira discussion, so I'll table this for now. Suffice to say though, this was fucking irritating. Speaking of irritating, let's talk Baatar Jr. The guy mostly serves as background decoration for season 3, but once season 4 rolls around he's revealed to be a complete and utterly unlikable bitch, which I partly attribute to his VA. And this isn't me casting shade, this is actual praise. Todd Haberkorn is really good at giving characters the vocal equivalent of an extremely punchable face. And he's bringing his fucking A-game here. Baatar Jr. is nothing but an asshole throughout all of season 4. He talks down to Bolin, he shit-talks his family, and he basically makes himself the kind of douchebag you really want to see get taken down a few notches. Oh, and let's not forget that he's engaged to his sister. Kuvira was adopted into the Bei-Fong family when she was 8, so this whole engagement thing is just weird and gross.
You're going to have to get over your grudge with her. I'm sure you've heard that we're engaged. She's going to be an official member of our family.
Wow, thanks for telling us what you think of adoptees, Bryke. So glad you shared that with the class. This smug bastard has no redeeming qualities, and the only reason he's here at all is to salvage Varric's Spirit Vine weapon research after he and Bolin defect, and to serve as another example of how Kuvira is too far gone when she attempts to spirit laser his ass. But I'll be honest, just like with Varric, I wouldn't have been sad to see him go. Less so, actually. At least Varric wasn't a total bitch. Finally, there's Opal, who is complicated. She's the only airbender in the Bei-Fong family, and she serves as the only reason the crew arrive in Zaufu at all, which isn't a complaint, I think it all ties together nicely. She also ends up being Bolin's girlfriend, which shows she has good taste. Bolin should have girls, boys, and NBs all lining up for the chance to give him a smooch. He's great. I actually really like her in season 3 because she's one of the most level-headed characters. She calls Bolin out for being weird to her, she stops Lin and Sue from fighting and points out the fucking obvious.
What are you two doing? You're sisters! Why would you want to hurt each other?
And she even gets a really heartwarming scene with Lin later, showing us the softer side that the chief of police is always hiding. But there's also the problem that she's directly tied to how poorly the show treats Bolin in season 4. Bolin joins Kuvira in her crusade to reunite the Earth Kingdom, and while it can be inferred that he does this because Korra is recovering and he wants to help her, the actual reason is that the writers think he's the only member of the crew stupid enough to fall for Kuvira's lies, and so Opal spends the majority of season 4 just completely pissed off at him. And the thing is, viewer, and I want you to follow me on this, I do kind of get it. Opal sees Kuvira as having betrayed her family and turned her brother against them. So logically, anyone helping Kuvira would be a similar target of her wrath for understandable reasons. But Bolin's reasoning is never explained, and even if the writers were willing to give him the chance to explain himself, it's pretty obvious that Opal wouldn't listen, so her likability took a huge hit for a lot of people, who just saw her as being unreasonably mean to Bolin. And literally all this would be fixed if the two were just given time to talk. But no, Bolin just keeps getting chewed out, and then he has to go with her to rescue her family, and then all's forgiven, and at no point is any of this fair to him. I already suggested a way to fix this in the crew video, it's in the Asami section, but I really think Opal was done dirty by Bryke's refusal to take Bolin or his feelings seriously. Finally, there's Wu, and I won't mince words. I fucking hate the guy. Wu is the nephew of the Earth Queen, and the next in line because she doesn't have kids, because who the fuck would marry this woman? And Wu is just the most annoying, entitled little shit who spends all of his time being babysat by Mako because God knows he can't be left alone for 5 fucking minutes. And basically every interaction he has with another character leaves them with less respect for the guy and me hating him more. The only time he's not completely insufferable is when he suggests evacuating the citizens, which is a great idea that for some reason nobody else fucking thinks of, but he can't even do that without ruining it.
Nice job in there. I'm proud of you. You're starting to act like the kind of king I'd like to work for.
Thanks. And if Korra buys this man of the people thing, I still might get to date her.
You always have to ruin it.
What? Come on! Why do you think guys do anything great? To pick up girls. Every work of art, every song, every city evacuation. All for the ladies.
God, I fucking hate you. Wu is the least qualified leader on the goddamn planet, and everyone fucking recognizes this, and it's largely because he sucks so much that I ended up completely siding with Kuvira when she announced that she's not handing the nation over to him, because nobody in their right mind would leave him in charge of a fucking tea party, let alone a nation. And even he seems to recognize this, as at the end of the series he implies he doesn't think he's fit to rule and wants to turn the Earth Kingdom into a democracy, but this isn't followed up on and it feels as token as Sue's political stance. I do think he could potentially be fixed though, and in my last video, I said I'd do it by pairing him up with Mako, which is only partially to fucking spare the entire female population of having to deal with him. I think it would be really interesting if Wu's girl craziness was actually just a cover for his homosexuality. See, out of all the nations in the world of Avatar, and I want to thank Tetraphobe49 for bringing this to my attention. Seriously, thank you my dude. The Earth Kingdom has been the slowest to accept homosexuality, and has even been militaristically repressive towards them. And even though Avatar Kyoshi was bisexual, she was never really able to effect any meaningful change. So a royal who liked men, who grew up with the single most spiteful bitch on the planet for an aunt and queen, would be understandably terrified of coming out, and I think it would make for a fascinating story. I would propose that Wu, terrified of anyone, especially his aunt growing suspicious of him, adopted a sort of playboy personality. But it comes so unnaturally and feels so wrong that it only serves to make him utterly unlikable, which would suck, but it would be better than being disowned or possibly killed for liking guys. But then he'd get Mako, an incredibly handsome man, assigned as his bodyguard, and in the midst of the complete upheaval of his life brought about by the Earth Queen's demise, he would latch onto Mako and steadily fall in love with him. Enough that sometimes, when it's just the two of them, he would show his real self. Things like his love of singing and dancing, and Mako would slowly grow to like the real Prince Wu. Mako was basically entirely defined by his relationships in the first 2 seasons, and then love never comes up again for him. So what if this was what made him realize he was bisexual? Wouldn't that be amazing? If a guy who was terrified of being caught, and a guy for whom loving men was an entirely new experience, found solace in each other. It would certainly explain why Mako bothers sticking close to Wu after the coronation, because if I was Mako, I'd have fucking kicked the kid to the curb the moment I was given a single out. You wouldn't even have to change Wu's public persona all that much. He'd just need to be afraid to show his real self to anyone but Mako, and have Mako's attitude towards him stem more from his frustration that Wu put on this act at all, instead of it being that he just hates the bozo's guts. I mentioned in the crew video that I'd have replaced episode 8 of book 4, which is mainly a shitty recap episode, with one where the couples of the show, Korra and Asami, Bullet and Opal, etc., all just sit down and have conversations with each other. That's where I put Korra and Asami's confession, and is where I'd put Mako and Wu's as well. I think I'd have the two just hang out in Mako's apartment with some music on, where they'd talk about their responsibilities and eventually their feelings for each other. And I'd end it with Wu asking Mako to dance with him, which Mako would obviously be reluctant to at first, but eventually he'd agree and they'd end it with a kiss. I recognise that I've basically just written a fanfic for a pair that I don't actually ship, but I think there's real emotional potential in the story that I've just come up with. And while I can't speak for anyone else, it would at least make me like Wu more if we got to see him as more than just a spoiled, annoying little pissant who nobody takes seriously. Hell, you could even have one of the reasons that he gives up on his royal status be that he wants to live a life where he can be his real self without fear, and that he wants Mako to be a part of that. That'd be soft as fuck and twice as precious. I gotta stop writing romance stories in these videos. I get way too into them.
A narrative waste of patches and light. We grew up in the suburbs, then we cut all our sides. Now just take a look at the super clear eyes. I'm a friend that wrote a pencil bit to the right.
Okay, so I generally try to avoid direct comparisons between original media and their sequels. I try to do my best to judge a show or a game on its own merits, and while it's impossible to fully avoid, I still try. However, I can't avoid that entirely with Korra, because some of the original cast is still here, and they inform a decent portion of the show. Part of the reason the crew was never able to find their own foothold was because they had to compete with the Gaang and their descendants for screen time, and so they ended up just not getting the development they needed. And while I'm not going to go into it in too much detail here, because I'm planning on doing a video on the Gaang themselves at some point in the future, I do still want to talk about them here just a little bit, because I do think it's important. So first of all, Aang, Sokka and Suki are all dead. Well, Suki is probably dead. I honestly wonder if Breck just forgot she existed, because she isn't mentioned in any capacity, and Sokka isn't mentioned as having any kids at all, which was weird. Whatever, he only exists in a flashback anyway, so he really doesn't matter much for this discussion either. And Aang has to be dead, because Korra's here and that's how the Avatar cycle works. I don't have a lot to say about Aang in this, since his presence is largely only felt in the effect that he had on his children. Otherwise, he literally only shows up in a flashback in Season 1, and to help Tenzin move past his daddy issues in Season 2, before Korra's connection to the past avatars is severed, and he just never matters again. But outside of this, I do want to address the fact that he was kind of a shit parent who favoured Tenzin to the point of emotionally neglecting Kaya and Bumi, because I know a lot of people got really angry about this, but I honestly think it fits his character. Aang, being the lone survivor of the genocide of the air nomads, was an integral part of his character in the show named after the fact that he was the only survivor of the genocide of the air nomads. And something that went largely unaddressed in that show, whose name escapes me at the moment, is that the weight of maintaining their culture was set squarely on his shoulders. So it actually makes perfect sense that he would focus so much on Tenzin, because for the first time in his life, he had hope that his culture had a chance to survive him. And I really don't think he was aware of just how much pressure he was putting on Tenzin, or how much he hurt Kaya and Bumi by leaving them out of it. Tenzin himself didn't realise just how much he was favoured in this regard, and the conversation the siblings had addressing this was honestly one of my favourite parts of Season 2. Aang was a bad parent, but in a way that made perfect sense for his character. And I know people really didn't like this, but Avatar fans have been misreading and misremembering the Gaang since the show first aired. Toph, however, I have really mixed feelings on the direction they took her in the show. Of the members of the Gaang, Toph and Zuko had the least amount of character development after joining, but while for Zuko this was because his character arc was played out in parallel to the Gaang all throughout the series, for Toph, it was because she was already kind of perfect. That's not to say that she didn't grow, however, because the character arc she had was largely about learning to open up and rely on other people. Due to her parents treating her like a porcelain doll, Toph grew a serious hatred for being underestimated or told what to do, which is the bulk of the reason she butted heads with Katara so much. And she also didn't like showing vulnerability. But Toph was fully capable of opening up to people, and she did it on multiple occasions, even to Appa. She doesn't actually want to drive people away, she just wants to be treated like a normal person whose feelings matter. All of this is to say that I do actually think her being a bad parent makes sense, but her being a cop doesn't. A person's relationship to their parents tends to influence their own parenting style. If you felt your parents did a good job, you're more likely to emulate them. But if you feel that they failed you, then you'll probably try to do the opposite. Toph's parents smothered her and tried to lock her up for her own protection, which she fucking despised. So she was a far more hands-off parent. Too hands-off actually, as she essentially neglected her daughters. And this makes sense. But I think Bryke made Toph too emotionally constipated, and I just don't like how far they took it, making her a fucking isolated hermit who won't even tell her own daughter who her father is. And again, I really don't like that Toph was a cop. She demonstrated a problem with authority all throughout the first show, and while she learned to work well with others, she was never the kind of person who would want a job enforcing the law or stifling people's freedoms. I honestly think the reason that she became a cop was because the writers wanted a metal-bending police force and worked backwards from that desire to justify it. I don't know, maybe I missed something, but it just doesn't seem to fit for me. And then there's Katara, who I think suffered the most in the characterization department. I don't want to go too far into it here, but my problem with her in The Legend of Korra is actually pretty well summarized by her role in the opening scene, where Korra's teachers are shitting on her for not being spiritual. Long story short, Katara should have gotten angry at them for talking down to Korra, or at least defended her in some way. While a lot of people tend to describe Katara as motherly, and that's basically the extent of her character in this show, a much bigger part of Katara's character was defined by her anger. Katara was pissed off all the time, and more often than not it was for justifiable reasons. In my video on Karlach, I mentioned that anger is the brain's natural reaction to injustice, and Katara was practically defined by this. Katara would call out any and all unfairness and injustice, and she'd never turn her back on someone in need. The entire reason she fought Pakku in the first place was because he was such an insufferable sexist bastard who refused to respect her or Aang. And as the series went on, her anger never went away, she just learned to channel it better. I didn't actually realise why this scene bothered me so much until I sat down to write the script for this video. But it's not just that Korra's teachers are assholes, it's that it's a direct parallel to the scene with Pakku, right down to it being a balding old waterbender talking down to a far younger woman. She should have stopped the conversation right there and reprimanded them for treating Korra like that, but she doesn't. Why is it that every version of Katara made after the end of The Last Airbender has zero fucking energy to them? Katara was a lot of things, but bland wasn't one of them. Also, why the fuck was Katara not on the panel of judges at Yakone's trial? She was the entire reason bloodbending was made illegal at all, and they couldn't bring her in for her expert opinion? What, was she watching the kids that night? Hire a fucking babysitter! Katara had way more reason to be on the panel than fucking Sokka did, what the fuck, guys? God, she just gets no respect at all. Anyway, last of all is Zuko, who I think actually makes the transfer between shows mostly unscathed. He's a pretty simple version of himself, but he's also an extremely minor character in this show, so that makes sense. He actually has two really good scenes in Korra, the first of which is his awkward little conversation with Eska, which is just really funny.
We built this place secretly with your father to hold a very special prisoner. She's a powerful firebender named Pali who can create explosions with her mind. Ironically, I hired a guy with a similar ability to kill the Avatar myself once. Didn't work.
Don't feel bad. I tried to kill Korra after she ruined my wedding. It happens.
And the second is when Korra seeks his advice and lets it slip that she spoke with Iroh in the spirit world, because his reaction is perfect. He clearly didn't know that Iroh had taken up residence there, and this is him realising he might be able to see his uncle again. It's a really nice moment. And according to the wiki, he actually does reunite with his uncle later on, which is delightful. It was a really good story decision. I'm glad they went with it. Despite all my complaints, I do think that Korra actually has a really strong supporting cast. Most of them are quite likeable, and even the ones that aren't are at least fun to talk about. But all of the focus put on the secondary and tertiary characters really did end up weakening the crew themselves, and that led to a much weaker show overall. One of the downsides to serialized storytelling, and I feel I should clarify that neither serialized nor episodic storytelling are inherently superior to the other, is that you're kind of stuck with the characters once you make them. In an episodic show, if a character ends up not working, you can largely move past it. But in a show like Korra, so much of the narrative relies on continuity, and you can't just drop something that doesn't work, you have to carry it along to the end. And this sadly was one of the things that ended up dragging the show down. Korra's supporting cast is a mess. It's a fun mess, but it's a mess nonetheless. Anyway, next time I'll be talking about the villains of the show, so look forward to that. But for now, I've got a Castlevania video to get started on. Thank you for watching. I've been Right and Real Slow, and I hope you have a lovely day.